Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Today we are comparing once again Synology and QNAP, and in today's video we're going to be looking at the new versus the old. We're going to be looking at the Synology DS920, probably one of the most popular NASs for almost 2 years at the time of recording, and we are comparing it against this, the new fully featured solution from QNAP that they are hoping will be their next big NAS. Now, for those that aren't aware, the DS920 came out in about spring, summer 2020, depending on where you are in the world. Do you remember those days? What a great year 2020 was. Oh my God. And this system was the follow-up to the popular 918 that came before it. And although it didn't change a whole lot of things, it had a new CPU and it changed and tweaked, things within DSM, with DSM-7 finally arriving towards the end of that year. It has to be said that as an upgrade on its predecessor, it wasn't an enormous jump. It changed a few little tiny things, but that was really it. It moved a few of the internal components and changed some of its architecture there. Now, the new TS-464 is the follow-up to its 2020 release, which was the 453D. Now, the jump between that system and this system is actually a lot more significant. And in those systems, in that time that's gone by, in those 2-year period when we've seen hardware change in power, efficiency, and price tag, of course, it has to be said that the TS-464 is probably one of the most mature decision QNAP NASs I've ever talked about here on the channel. The one that came before it, the 53D, the CPU it had and what they were trying to do with it in terms of its chipset and lanes, it pushed itself arguably a little thinner in some areas than it really should have. And this is something that I think in a number of areas have been addressed in the TS-464. However, these two systems do have almost 2 years of release difference between them, and I think it would be remiss to, not at least touch on at one point, of course, that this is actually noticeably more affordable than that of the QNAP there, and with both brands having a very different focus in terms of what they provide ideally to the end user and what they're trying to put out for their brand and what the user experience that you will have when using them. I do think comparing these two right now in April 2022 at time of recording, which one best deserves your data, because although they have very different price tags, where that money ends up being spent is actually quite markedly different as well. So I said let's talk about money as the first big difference between these two devices. Now, but depending on when you're watching this, there may be a follow-up to this device right now when you're watching this video, so do check. Now, this is the DS920, but there may be a DS922 or 923 in the future, which may be a more balanced comparison. However, the DS920 is still, I bet, even now when you're watching this in the future, a bloody good NAS. It arrives with the full featured support of the entire range of applications from Synology's catalogue of services, their tools, first party and third party support there. Everything from standard architectural differences, such as its utilization of BTRFS, its support of Synology Hybrid RAID, where you can mix and match the drives. Then you've got DSM-7's incredibly intuitive and fast responding platform, and all of those great Synology collaboration suite applications, and those that replace a lot of the apps and tools that you already use from third parties in your home or business environment there. Now, the price tag for this device knocks around, give or take, for about $450 to about £500. Now you can translate that round wherever you are in the world, but the reason I mention that price tag being so flexible is because the device has been in the market for between 18 and 24 months, depending on where you are in the world. And in that time, with so much stock level out there, and indeed it being available for that length of time, and potential talk of a follow-up to this device somewhere in the pipeline, at least in rumour, then chances are that when you see this device online, whether you're looking at, special offers and deals or even just the standard price online, you're going to get the 920 somewhere in that 450 to 500 quid price tag. It's had that much time in the market to be a lot more flexible on its price tag. Now, conversely, the TS-464 at the time of recording is very new. It's like not even a week old in terms of its availability in the world right now. Its stock levels are nowhere near as widespread. Its notoriety is nowhere near as high as the 920. And indeed, its price tag is a lot closer to its recommended retail price, the RRP. The result is This system is knocking around for about 550 to nearly 600 Nicker. That is a big, big difference. Now, as time wears on, this is going to become more affordable. It's going to be lowered in price. It's going to, be more available, and therefore the price, and there'll be special offers. But right now, at the time of recording, between these two devices, this system is by far the better value proposition in terms of what you're paying for it. And indeed, if you're looking for a nice baseline NAS experience, although there is seriously significantly better hardware in the newer release, as you would expect, it has to be said that even if you break it down into value, right now, this is probably the better choice between them, both because of the price tag and because of the baseline of the hardware. The minute you want to talk about expandability, the minute you want to talk about upgradability, the minute you want to talk about bandwidth, things change quite rapidly. And that's what brings us into our next section, hardware. Now, the hardware of these two devices, a lot has changed in a year and a half to 2 years between these two devices. But even when the 920 was first released, there were some people at launch that went, what, is that it? And that's true. The CPU inside is great for the price point. Remember, this is targeting prosumers and SMB, so professional consumers and small, medium business users. It's not targeting your value budget tier. It's not targeting the upper echelons, your high business and whatever. It's going for the middle, and it's a flagship product, kind of the Reebok Classic from the Synology range there. It is kind of their device they put in front of you and say, this will do everything that we say we can do. Now, that CPU I mentioned, the J4125 inside this device, has been a very popular chip for the last 2 to 3 years. It's featured on pretty much every NAS brand platform, and indeed in the home build scene as well. It's an Intel Celeron quad-core based processor at 2.0 GHz that can be burst up to 2.7 GHz for each of those cores. It's got HD 600 embedded graphics, a hardware encryption engine there. It can transcode 4K and 1080p media, and it arrives with support of up to 8 GB of DDR4 memory. The base level system arrives with 4 GB of DDR4 memory soldered to the board, so you can't remove it or change it. But that 4 GB, bang, 4 little modules there. I believe they were 4 Samsung individual 1 GB memory modules on the board, can be upgraded by a further 4 GB of Synology memory there, the DDR4 memory from them. And that brings you up, if you choose to that 8 GB of memory. You can't exceed that. That is the Intel recommended maximum there. We have experimented with installing all manner of third-party memory there in the past in other videos, which again can lead to barriers on your support with the brand, but still nonetheless, even when you exceed it, you are moving out of a potential stable environment there. But still nonetheless, 8 GB of memory, that lovely little 4-core processor. CPU benchmark, rate that CPU at just over 3,000. I think it's 301 or 5 or 6 thousand on their measurements of CPUs. That is a current reading as well. These things change over time. Alongside that CPU and the memory, the system also arrives with M2 NVMe SSD base there on the rear. You can install a couple of M2 SSDs from the likes of WD Red's SN700 and the Seagate Iron Wolf 510 and 525 series that will allow you to install some SSDs that can be used for caching. Now, there's good and bad news there. The good news is, if you're going to use it for caching, it's a very, very well-developed system for caching there, with write caching being readily available, where when you upload files to the device, they are written to the SSD and then moved to the slower archival hard drive storage array. So again, it can much improve some of the uploads and sending data to the system. Conversely, with read caching there, what it can do is look at the files that you're accessing most frequently, and again, these are generally the small files, and then copies them over to the SSDs to hasten their access when they are required. So that's all good stuff, but those SSD bays at the base can't be used for raw storage. You can install M2 NVMe inside, but you can't use them as a raw storage pool there within Synology's platform DSM, which again, for a number of you, is a bit annoying. You can go on GitHub. There's a few kind of unofficial ways to get around that and use those NVMEs for storage, but still nonetheless, I think the idea that those bays can only be used for that is a little bit of a bummer for some people. Also, although it does not affect this system at all, it's worth highlighting that Synology have changed some of their approach and stance on compatibility and support of third-party drive media in some of their enterprise-grade systems in 22 and above. Now, do bear in mind, again, that only really affects currently the top tier and the enterprise and the high-end business tier there. So even if there was a follow-up to this, I think it would be very unlikely, as it stands at least now, that a follow-up to this would have that that limitation and that change in support there of third-party drives. But still, nonetheless, that is something the brand has kind of done there. It will never be done retroactively. I can never see Synology doing that. But that's really it for the internal hardware of this device. If we look at the new QNAP there, the TS-464, we see a very different range of things. And of course, this is where that 2 years of difference has to really pay for itself, okay? So the CPU inside is an Intel Celeron. Again, at this tier here, you thinking of the price tag they're trying to maintain, the 450, 550 sort of price point there at this point in their respective portfolios. This device arrives with an Intel Celeron N5095 /N5105 processor there. The reason for that is there's 2 CPUs listed that due to the pandemic, hardware shortages, droughts in Taiwan, semiconductor shortages, you name it, changes in manufacturing patterns. The result is that whereas previously Intel would run a CPU and then phase it out for a new CPU revision and then phase it out, there's been so many different lines running at once because of all of the effects I've just mentioned that this particular tier of Intel Celeron processors, it's kind of a free-for-all right now. And although the 2 CPUs listed I've just mentioned are different, they are so identical it's unreal. There's only tiny differences in encode decode there. And again, you'll be hard pushed to feel that difference from what I can see about those processors. But nonetheless, both of those CPUs are 2.0 GHz per core that can be burst up to 2.9 GHz or higher frequency. It also has a better and more efficient GPU onboard component, and that CPU also supports up to 16 gig of DDR4 memory. Very, very important there. So this can support up to 16 gig. This supports up to 8. Moreover, the QNAP platform doesn't use that soldered memory. There's 4 gig of memory inside there, which can be upgraded to 16 gig with 2 8 gig sticks. But also, you don't have to use QNAP branded memory. You can use Crucial, you can use Samsung, you can use the memory. They have a compatibility list. We've run a bunch of tests already. So whereas that memory thing may make a big difference to some people who want to make sure they keep it in-house branding, there are another phase of users that will look at Synology's first-party memory, which is notably more expensive than the likes of, again, Samsung, Crucial, and Kingston and more, for the same 4 gig stick of sodium 2666 megahertz, and go, well, they just stuck a sticker on it. Now, moving forward from that CPU also on CPU Benchmark has a higher score as well of 4,161. So that's an enormous jump of 20 to 25% higher rating there on CPU Benchmark for the newer CPU over the old, which again, I would expect, I would want it to be better, not only because of the price difference, but the time difference as well. But an interesting development as well is this system also has M2 NVMe SSD bays inside. It has 2 bays inside the system there, and those 2 bays can be used for write caching, can be used for read caching, can be used for read and write combination caching, but they can also be used for tiered storage and also used for a storage pool. A storage pool, you're well aware, is when you have an area of different bays that are all put together there in that RAID storage pool, I should say. But on top of that, you can use Q-tier. Q-tier is when it takes hard drive storage media, SSD storage media, and combines it into this single pool. And as data is written to it, when some data is more frequently accessed than others, whereas caching will move some of those smaller files over to the, or copy those smaller files over to the SSD. In Q-tier, it physically moves them onto the SSD, and it also deals with larger file types as well, which can be very useful for those that are looking at file editing on the fly. Now, alongside those M2 SSD slots in there, and the M2 SSD slots in here, it's worth talking about the lanes there, because one of the reasons I think Synology doesn't allow the M2 NVMe lanes to be used for raw storage, aside from just the general wear and tear of SSDs in a system like this, it's to do with that CPU being so overstretched. So in the case of the QNAP, those M2 bays inside, even though they support PCIe Gen 3 SSDs, which can currently hit between 3000 and 3400 megabytes per second, this runs PCIe Gen 3 times 1 lanes. So the lanes that you put the M2 SSDs inside will not be able to exceed 1000 megs. PCIe Gen 3 times 1 is 1000 megabytes per second. That's all you've got. So although you can use them for raw storage and can use them for all that other stuff, do bear in mind that those lanes are not going to give you what you think the full performance of an NVMe SSD can be. Now, we've never dug deep into the 920, but we know that CPU, we know the lanes that are inside there, we know the system has the 4 bays, it's got a couple of LANs. I would be very surprised if the lanes inside this system are greater than maybe PCIe Gen 2 times 4, or maybe Gen 3 times 1, maybe Gen 2, I'm not sure. But I don't think the NVMe bays in this system are going to give you more than 2000 megs each. I just don't think there's the available architecture in the chipset and that CPU together to allow that. So even though you've got probably a higher performance available, that performance is still going to be limited to caching. Next up, let's talk about ports and connections, because that is one enormous area of difference between these two devices here. Not just because of the way the brands conduct a lot of their hardware, not just in these releases, but in the previous 2, 5, 10 years, but also where that newer architecture has opened up thanks to that CPU inside the newer QNAP there. So in the case of the Synology, the ports you have are as follows. There's a USB there on the front there, and inside we've got a couple of 1 gigabit Ethernet ports there. We've got an eSATA port and another USB. Now, going a little deeper there, the LAN ports there are gigabit Ethernet, so they're 1 GBE each, which admittedly, even in 2020, people were not overly fond of. I get why this was never going to have a 10 gigabit Ethernet port there. It would have sucked up most of the internal architecture just to get that and ruin the price point. But on top of that, 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, even in 2020, was starting to be implemented on routers, starting to be implemented in a lot of switches, and indeed, we're seeing now in 2021 and indeed 2022 that some ISP, internet service providers, are arriving with 2.5 gigabit Ethernet on their routers, which have greater than gigabit internet speeds as well in some places. The result is that this NAS, without the use of lag, because you do have the option of link aggregation trunking those ports, that this has the potential to be slower than a remote cloud, which is insane. Now, at the bottom there, you've got that eSATA port that allows you to add 5 more bays of storage to this system with the DX517. I'll also add that thanks to Synology's hybrid RAID, that SHR system, this system is so much smoother to upgrade than any system out there from another brand. You've got to love Synology Hybrid RAID. I love that they do it. Only one other brand I know of, in the form of Drobo, who haven't heard from them in years, implement and provide a system like that. And I do think that's something Synology should really have across their entire brand platform, but they stop it at the enterprise tier and only allow it on systems underneath. But it does allow expandability to be considerably easier and more flexible in its storage. Now, we've also got these USB ports that can be used for USB backups, can be used for printers and scanners and UPSs. But I say printers and scanners, a lot of that stuff has actually been rescinded. A lot of USB supported peripherals in the time since this has been released have kind of been changed, and a lot of them have been dropped in DSM-7. So these USB ports are pretty much, I would say, only used for UPSs for most people, and you can't really use network adapters that much anymore, or Wi-Fi adapters. I would say that's for storage. Now, in terms of storage, it's USB 3.2 Gen 1. The USB naming convention has gone nuts the last few years, but nonetheless, that means that this will provide up to a maximum of 5 gigabits per second performance, up to around 540 megabytes per second there, which again, if you use a fast enough SSD or a RAID configuration, you can saturate that, which you might use for backing up the NAS or backing up onto the NAS on the fly as you choose. So they're good. they're good ports. And again, I mentioned at the top of the video, in terms of value, you're getting pretty, really decent stuff. The 1 gigabit Ethernets have rubbed people up the wrong way, but for the most part, in terms of hardware, you can't really complain. You're getting an acceptable standard quality there. Although its expandability and upgradability is a little lower, remember, 4 gig and adding 5 drives. Can't really upgrade the network interface ports. Again, you can use adapters and some unofficial GitHub type stuff to add 5 GB adapters, but that's really a lot in terms of connectivity. Let's see what's happened in a year and a half to 2 years over at these guys. Now, this is nuts, frankly, and this CPU is a big part of that. But if we look at the base of this system, we can see, first and foremost, we've got USB, but we've got that red port there. Now, there is a USB red port there. This red port is USB 3.2 Gen 2. That is 10 gigabits per second connectivity, or 1,000 megabytes per second throughput there over USB. And if you're using like NVMe SSDs there with USB 3.2 Gen 2, SanDisk and WDNC, I've got some great expansion SSDs there over USB with some good storage capacities as well. You can get some 1,000 megs backup to and fro set up on this device quite easily. Also, USB support on the QNAP platform is still a great deal broader. Not only have you got a lot more Wi-Fi adapters and printers and scanners, and of course the UPS ones that we mentioned earlier on, but then you can officially use 5 GBE to USB to 5 gigabit Ethernet adapters like that one. You can use 2.5 gigabit Ethernet adapters, which are like 25 quid to add more network ports. Subject to network ports, this system has 2 of them, and it has 2 times 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. So both of these ports are 2.5 GBE, which means around 269-70 megabytes per second potential per port, with link aggregation bringing it well in excess of 540 megabytes per second there. So again, great performance with network connectivity. It's not 10 GBE, but then this system has a PCIe upgrade slot as well. So it might not be 10 GBE, but you can add 10 GBE. You can pick up 10 GBE cards nowadays for about 80 to 90 quid at the cheap end, but some fully featured ones knock around for about 120, 130. This system, with its PCIe Gen 3 x 2 slot there, so 2,000 megs throughput with the PCIe bandwidth there, can even support a 2-port 10 GBE card there, which is pretty bloody impressive. There's even combo cards, and both brands have their own range of combo cards that allow you to add NVMe SSD bays underneath this heatsink and 10 GBE on a single card. That's not all good news, because that card is going to have 2 NVMe bays on it and a 10 GBE port. There's no way you're going to be able to utilize the full bandwidth potential of those 2 services on that 2,000 megabytes per second PCIe slot, the Gen 3 x 2 slot there. But it's still nice to have that scalability there, and that's something that Synology provide on a number of their larger scale solutions, like that one just over there in the corner there, that 6-bay with the Ryzen, but it's not something available in the 920 currently. I mentioned the USB ports there as well. We can talk about expandability with this system providing the option to add 2-bay, 4-bay, 6-bay, 8-bay and 12-bay expansions onto the system over USB or PCIe JBOD boxes there. Some of them are hardware RAID, some of them are just JBOD, and the system can manage it. That scalability, once again, in terms of memory, in terms of PCIe, in terms of the storage pools of the M2, in terms of USB expandability, there's even HDMI out. I'm not going to talk too much about that because that's a kind of thing that some people use and some people don't. It is a very well architectured system, and this is what I mean about it being a more mature NAS. If you look at the 53D that came before it, it felt like they overstretched too much. They provided a PCIe, but it was 2 times 2, it's 1,000 megs. You were already going to be bottlenecking to try to do 2 things at once, and it didn't have the M2s. This seems to have provisioned better for that internal architecture in a way that its predecessor had not. And in terms of hardware, yes, it has a higher price point there, and unless you're going to use all those features, you may be paying for something you're not going to use. But you cannot argue with its scalability. You can't argue with its upgradability overall there. And overall, when it comes to the hardware side, both internally and ports and connections, the QNAP wins this by a country mile. But it's not just about, let's be honest, about the hardware, is it? Both of these solutions from their respective brands in QNAP and Synology are more than just CPU, memory and ports. They both arrive with their respective software platforms in the form of QTS and DSM. Now, we can tackle this subject in a number of ways. First and foremost, we can talk about which of the platforms is quote unquote better. And to be perfectly frank, if you are quite new to NAS, or you're not too IT literate, or you're looking for something that you can set up and forget, you don't want to have to interact with it too much, you want to replace a lot of the third-party client tools, or you want to buy a system that includes all of the features with it, all in a proprietary first-party umbrella, while still maintaining an incredibly high level of user-friendly design, this bad boy right here. DSM is as slick as it gets in terms of its design, with the Apple rhetoric and presentation, as well as the intuitiveness of the likes of Windows and Android in terms of its client applications, in terms of how the apps work, simplification in their setup. The system makes incredible moves to make itself as user-friendly as possible, whether you're a high-end business user with an in-house IT admin, or just a home user that just wants to set up a Plex media server to sit on a PlayStation and watch. It is a great system in terms of its software, with add-on features in Surveillance Station and virtual machine manager there. Then you've got the collaboration suite, Synology Drive, Synology Office, Synology Mail, Synology Chat, Synology Photos, Synology Audio Station and the files. It's just a great software platform. And if you compare them side by side, your eyes will always be more drawn to the Synology side for its incredible design there. Now, the QNAP platform QTS, it's no slouch. QTS 5 still looks the business, but it has to be said, it does have a slightly higher learning curve, and it does, not feel as slick in its UI compared with the Synology. It's better than all the other ones out there, but it's just not matching against DSM in terms of its overall design and fluidity between the windows and the different design of different applications and windows and menus. The other thing about QTS though is it is so much more customizable and flexible. You have a level of control and a level of customization that is just not available on the Synology platform. The Synology, you will often set the system up with your data and your processes, and a lot of the time the Synology will go, whoa, that's not how I do this. I need you to do it this way. Once you do it this way, it will be better than it can ever be, and it will perform incredibly well. But we need you to lay out your data, your process this way, because we've built the system to be a lot more streamlined and a little bit more like a console than a PC as far as gamers. That's similarly that I always use there. It's a great platform, but it's a little bit more rigid and not quite as customizable as the QNAP one. The QNAP side, it basically sits there and goes, what do you want me to do? And then you can make it point in the direction, and you can get it to read the files and distribute the files and access repositories the way you want it to be. Unfortunately, and we've been here for the last 18 months to 2 years, that's not always a good thing, because of course QNAP have been hit by a fair range of woes in terms of security, with a number of ransomware attacks thanks to vulnerabilities targeting their platform. Probably a little bit more, if not a lot more, than any other brand out there right now. Now, some of that was vulnerabilities that were inherent to Linux. Linux is always going to be a target. It's the most widely used platform out there. It's in Android. It's in so many different services that we use without even knowing it. And when vulnerabilities are found, Linux patches them up pretty darn quick, but it takes longer for the other platforms that are built on them to slowly take kind of take the system and repair some of those holes using the builds from Linux. And sometimes when those vulnerabilities are found, some of them are inherent to the platform. Where I'm getting at is, with the QNAP side being so flexible and so customizable, sometimes it can allow the user to be able to change things that they really shouldn't be allowed to change. Or if they change them, they need to only be able to do them under preset conditions. Only if the system has a two-stage backup. Only if you have a sufficient VPN or randomized port defaults. Although they have changed a lot of things in QTS in recent months, it has to be said that even now, you can change and customize a heck of a lot on the QNAP platform that some users shouldn't really be allowed to play with without it ultimately undermining the security on the system there. Now, there's blame on all sides, but the majority of the blame is with QNAP. They've tried to change their UI, they've changed the way the presentation of some settings are made, but they've tried their hardest to do this while simultaneously keeping the customization and the freedom and bespoke build nature of QTS, and I just don't think the two can mesh. Short of a button that goes easy mode, intermediate, hard mode, I don't think they can do it. They've got a bunch of stuff on there: the security advisor, malware scanner, antivirus, Q firewall, all kinds of stuff built into it along with that advisor. But yet here we are, 2 years since the release of the DS920. This hasn't had any widespread ransomware attacks. It has not had those reported issues that QNAP's NASs have, and I think a lot of that comes down to that closed platform, which for good or for bad does mean that these incidents where you can, leave the house with the door unlocked or at least with a shoddy lock are going to be less frequent on that Synology platform. So ultimately, although both platforms have a huge range of applications for virtualizations, for surveillance, and the QNAP in most cases gives you a little bit more, such as more camera licenses. You get 8 camera licenses, 2 on this. With virtual machines, there's a virtual machine marketplace where you can just download Windows VMs, download Ubuntu VMs, download pre-made containers in the application repository there. In all of the applications, even QMAGI does a better job overall between these systems with AI focused recognition of subjects and faces and more than Synology Photos. It comes at a price. It comes at a system requiring more input from you, more tinkering from you, and ultimately there's a burden of responsibility there on you which you may not be happy to take on your shoulders. And therefore, in terms of software, I'm going to always give it to the DSM platform there. Things have got close and there's been a lot of merger and crossover, but in terms of software, the DS920, even at 1.5 to 2 years older, it's still going to get the vote there. And this has been comparing these two NASs. Which one should you buy? If you've not already taken it from this video, if you know what you're doing, probably this one. Because if you know what you're doing, you know how to create a safe network, you've already got the outer ranges of your network already set up, and you want a system that's going to do what you want it to do. And if you're not interested in first-party applications, it's nice to have them, but you bought the NAS primarily for your own apps, this is going to be a lot more appealing. If you want the NAS to be more scalable, if you want to entertain 10 GB a year, if you want to entertain SSD pools, if you want to entertain just a lot more scope in your storage, then the QNAP is going to be the one for you. But if you want a handheld, if you want a system that can just sit there and do exactly what it says it can do, and if you want a system that is going to be streamlined, is going to be a fully featured experience without a headache, a potential headache at least, then the Synology DS920 is going to be the one for you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I know I went on a bit, but this is quite an important decision for some people that are going to be spending, including drives, close to $1,000 of money, and therefore, I hope a 30-minute video was worth your time. If not, let me know in the comments. Click like if you've enjoyed the video. Click subscribe if you want to learn more about these NASs and the subject of NAS overall. And of course, take advantage of the free advice section over on NAS Compares. It's linked in the description. Genuinely free. It's manned by me and Eddie the Web Guy. We just answer your questions. If you ever tried hiring a techie, they're not cheap. We're doing this for free. There's a donate button. Use it. Ignore it. It's supported by ad revenue. Again, you go down there, you put your inquiry, we don't do anything to your email, couldn't give a stuff about your email. It's unbiased, we don't get any bunts for it. We might recommend an Amazon link where we get a bit of affiliate change, but if it's not on there, we'll recommend any other site, to be honest. We've got a bunch of them. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.